We are here today with Juliellen Byrne, whose new show, The Mother Tongue, is coming to the Southern Ohio Museum of Art and Cultural Center starting November 19th. Julie, I just want to ask you a couple questions today. So first of all, what do you think is the most important thing that you want the viewer to take away?
A narrative. And I want the viewer to think about the ways in which they might interpret a story from what they've seen, hopefully different than my idea. That's the migratory part of the pollination of looking at a piece of work and coming up with your own interpretation, especially if you're not sure you like it, making that challenge more interesting and a little more difficult too. And to find something of your own life experience and or a life experience you hope you never have by seeing my work. I make a lot of rats. In truth, I have never seen a rat in my home or anywhere intimate. I mean, I've seen them in cages at COSI years ago. But rats are us. And I came to that realization after having read about them some. They are all of our best parts and all of our worst parts. They're fierce parenters. They are family oriented. They stick together. They're completely destructive of every environment they've ever been in. They exploit all food sources and all living environments in which humans survive. They do just beautifully. So in many ways, we kind of hate something that has the indomitability of us. And I think about that when I use rats. I also try to give them a few more human characteristics because I think we relate to them a little better that way. So I always like the animals that I'm using and or exploiting to have a vulnerability quality. And sometimes it's just me reading that. It's not necessarily something the viewer gets to always see or take away. So years ago I had a show at the Rife in Columbus and I had made these pieces for the show, and I was on the third floor of a studio building, and my mother had cancer at the time, but I also realized she hadn't been in my studio in a long time. So I invited her up, and then I realized what a dumb idea, she has to climb 3 flights of stairs, but she did it. And she came into the room and she was looking at the pieces the Rife were taking, and she said, "Why does everything you make look like me?" And it makes me think that sometimes artists are the wrong person to be looking at their work and saying anything about it. Because the touchstones we have for creating it are sometimes small and sometimes not, they're banal, they're not even all that earth-shattering. They can take on different significance once they're outside your head and outside the grasp of your hands. I use a lot of rabbits. Rabbits usually indicate, for me, a passing through. So in some ways, when I think about migration and the migration of ideas, and the migration of disease, and the migration of political ethics, I think about rabbits, and they're very alert, and then they make their decisions very quickly. And sometimes we do that as well. This piece is called Fight, and so I suppose the title itself adds something to the narrative of this, so the viewer can take away the idea of what seems to be a baby wearing boxing gloves, and what seems to be a rabbit wearing boxing gloves, and then we have the bird, who is either an omen or a blessing, depending on your perspective, and you have to build something from there. And I kind of started in the same place before I made the piece, so I have these cast of characters, and I can subject them to certain situations and see how I feel about it when I'm done. And very often, the story that a viewer sees has a really different interpretation than maybe the idea I had when I started. So, one thing I can tell you about this is that we buried my father during COVID 2 years ago, And it was kind of a sad time because there really wasn't a funeral, but there was a gathering at the graveyard. And in the middle of that, in the bitter cold, it began to snow. And the snow that fell was like tiny styrofoam balls, and it landed in our hair and in our coats and on our shoes and didn't melt. It just, you could shake it off. And so I thought about that white dot all over everything, the people I loved and the person we were burying. And I just felt the need to kind of repeat that somewhere, to give myself a reference point for that. And that is why it's dotted the way it is. But beyond that, I think the rest of the story is kind of up to the viewer to interpret. A couple of heads. There are a series of heads both here and at the university for you to see, but some of them have bird attachments. Sometimes that's because I've drawn them and the piece needed something else to help create or a foundation for a narrative. And I don't want to tell you what the whole story is, but I do want to get you feeling curious about it. And I think there is enough tension between the idea of being this close to a bird, and a lot of people don't like being this close to birds, and also the specialness of that. Because if you have had experiences with birds, I live with a chicken. It's the only animal I've ever owned that comes when it's called. And so you can end up with a much more personal relationship with birds than I think a lot of people think they're capable of. Birds on some level are still raptors, and we on some level are still cavemen. So I feel like the tension between these two is sort of ongoing. Also, I'd like to tell you that Stephen Sondheim has said that any poet or artist that relies on the iconography of birds is a very weak artist. And I read that way after I'd done a bunch of birds. So there you have it. So I started this interview talking about rats, and then there are several dogs in the show. I would tell you that a lot of my ideas germinate from a narrative. And the narrative about the rats started with a story my father told about his mother, who could corner a rat. Now mind you, this was in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and kill it with a broom, which I thought sounded phenomenal. But he said he remembered as a child walking into the kitchen to find her on a chair with her dress pulled up, because in those days women always wore dresses. And she was screaming because there was a spider on the floor. And so, that was the worst you could think of. So then you will see other animals, including dogs. There's a lot of dyslexia in my family. And I'll let you do the legwork for turning dog into another word, but I thought that was funny. And I started to think about ways in which humans and dogs can interact, exploiting that notion of dyslexia. And I found a Bible quote that said, and actually now there has now been a movie made from part of this quote, but I think it's Psalms 20:21. I can check that, I'm not quite sure. But it relates to saving my darling from the power of the dog. And so I sort of used that as a little launching point, and there are several dogs in the show that all relate back to that one. This piece is called Saving My Darling, and as you can tell, there's a couple of themes running through this one, including a carrot on a stick, and one wonders who's really in charge here, and that's also that kind of power dynamic is something I like thinking about. And so once I get a little germination of an idea, I can do drawings, and then I'll come back to them and find one that lets me think about it three-dimensionally.